Captain Sarah Chen had heard the whispers before. In the military aviation world, transport pilots were often dismissed as glorified bus drivers. "She's only transport," the fighter jocks would say with smirks, as if flying massive cargo planes through hostile territory was somehow less dangerous than their high-speed acrobatics. Sarah had learned to let it roll off her shoulders. But the sting never completely faded. On this particular Tuesday morning in Afghanistan, Sarah was preparing her C-130 Hercules for what seemed like another routine supply run. The mission briefing had been straightforward: transport equipment and personnel from Bagram Air Base to a forward operating base near the Pakistani border. Nothing glamorous. Nothing that would make headlines back home. Just another day moving the pieces that kept the war machine functioning. Sarah had been flying transport missions for 8 years, ever since she graduated from the Air Force Academy. She had always dreamed of flying fighters, but her exceptional skills in handling large aircraft under pressure had earned her a different path. While her classmates were dogfighting in F-16 seconds, Sarah was mastering the art of landing 70-ton aircraft on damaged runways under enemy fire. The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac as Sarah conducted her pre-flight inspection. Her crew chief, Master Sergeant Rodriguez, had already gone over every inch of the aircraft. But Sarah trusted no one more than herself when it came to the safety of her bird. The C-130 had served in 3 previous deployments, and its battle scars told stories of close calls and successful missions under fire. "Ma'am, we've got some last-minute passengers," Rodriguez called out from beneath the aircraft. "Looks like a small team of special operations guys." Sarah nodded without looking up from her inspection of the port engine. Special ops teams, hitching rides on transport flights, was nothing new. They often needed to get from point A to point B without drawing attention, and cargo flights provided perfect cover. These guys rarely spoke to the flight crew, kept to themselves, and usually disappeared as quietly as they had arrived. As Sarah climbed into the cockpit, she noticed the team boarding through the cargo ramp. Even in their standard Army uniforms, there was something different about them. They moved with a precision and quiet confidence that set them apart from regular infantry. Their equipment was top of the line but unmarked, and their faces carried the weathered look of men who had seen more combat than most soldiers would in a lifetime. The team leader, a tall man with steel-gray eyes, approached the cockpit. "Captain, I'm Major Jackson. My team appreciates the lift." "No problem, Major. We'll have you at your destination in about 2 hours," Sarah replied professionally. Jackson nodded but didn't move away immediately. "Captain, I should mention that our mission timeline might be flexible. We may need to adjust our return schedule." Quote, Sarah had heard similar requests before. Special operations missions rarely went according to the original plan. "Understood, sir. We'll be ready when you are." What Sarah didn't know was that Major Jackson's team wasn't just any special operations unit. They were Delta Force, the Army's most elite counterterrorism unit. And they were heading into one of the most dangerous regions of Afghanistan, on a mission that could change the course of the war. The flight to the forward operating base passed without incident. Sarah had flown this route dozens of times, threading between mountain peaks that scraped the belly of clouds, and navigating through valleys where Taliban fighters were known to operate. Her co-pilot, Lieutenant Davis, was relatively new to the theater, but had proven himself capable during their previous missions together. "Approach control. This is Herky 7 requesting landing clearance," Sarah radioed as they neared their destination. "Herky 7. You're cleared for approach runway 0 to 9. Be advised, we've had sporadic small arms fire in the area. Expedite your landing and offload." Sarah acknowledged the transmission and began her approach. The forward operating base was little more than a dirt airstrip, surrounded by concrete barriers and guard towers. Intelligence reports indicated that Taliban forces in the area had been increasingly active, but the base remained a crucial staging area for operations in the region. As the C-130 touched down and rolled to a stop, Sarah noticed increased activity around the base perimeter. More guards than usual were posted, and she could see additional armored vehicles positioned defensively around the airfield. Something was happening. But as a transport pilot, she wasn't privy to the operational details. Major Jackson's team quickly offloaded their equipment and disappeared into a cluster of buildings near the base command center. Sarah supervised the unloading of supplies, while Rodriguez conducted a post-flight inspection. They would remain on the ground for several hours, waiting for the return passengers and cargo. "Hey, Captain. You might want to hear this." Davis called from inside the aircraft where he was monitoring radio communications. Sarah climbed back into the cockpit and put on her headset. The radio chatter was more intense than usual, with multiple call signs reporting movement in the surrounding mountains. It sounded like a significant operation was underway, and from the urgency in the voices, it wasn't going according to plan. All stations, this is Overlord. Be advised, we have a developing situation. All aircraft are to maintain current positions until further notice." Came a transmission from the base command center. Sarah and Davis exchanged glances. A hold order like that usually meant trouble. They settled in for what could be a long wait, unaware that in a few hours, Sarah's skills as just a transport pilot would be put to the ultimate test. As the afternoon wore on, the radio traffic became increasingly frantic. Sarah could hear references to casualties, enemy contact, and requests for immediate extraction. Whatever Major Jackson's team was involved in, it had clearly gone sideways. Sarah found herself thinking about the quiet confidence she had seen in the Delta Force operators that morning, wondering if they were in the middle of whatever chaos was unfolding in the mountains. The first indication that her routine transport mission was about to become anything but routine came just as the sun began to set behind the jagged mountain peaks. Major Jackson himself came running across the tarmac toward her aircraft, his face grim and his uniform dusty from what looked like recent combat. "Captain Chen," he called as he approached the cargo ramp. "We need to talk, right now." Sarah quickly shut down the aircraft's auxiliary power unit and climbed down from the cockpit to meet Major Jackson. His face was streaked with sweat and dirt, and she could see dried blood on his sleeves. This wasn't the calm, controlled operator who had boarded her plane that morning. "Major, what's the situation?" Sarah asked, though the tension in his voice had already told her everything she needed to know. "Captain, we have a team trapped behind enemy lines. 12 of our best operators are pinned down in a valley about 60 miles northeast of here. The extraction helicopter took ground fire and had to abort. Weather's moving in, and we're looking at zero visibility within the hour." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She had heard this story before, and it rarely ended well. What about other extraction options? Surely there are other helicopters available. Jackson shook his head grimly. "The closest rescue birds are 3 hours out. Minimum. By then, our guys will either be overrun, or the weather will make any extraction impossible. The Taliban know exactly where they are, and they're moving reinforcements into the area." Lieutenant Davis had joined them, and Sarah could see the question in his eyes that she was afraid to ask. "Major, what exactly are you asking us to do?" Jackson looked directly at Sarah. "Captain, I know what they say about transport pilots. I know you're supposed to be just a bus driver in the sky. But I've done my homework on you. I know about your training scores, your combat record, and what happened during the Kandahar incident last year." Sarah was surprised he knew about Kandahar. During a routine supply mission, her C-130 had been forced to land under fire to evacuate wounded soldiers when their helicopter had been shot down. She had managed to get her massive aircraft into a landing zone barely long enough for a fighter jet, pulled out 37 wounded Americans, and taken off while being shot at from 3 directions. "The thing is, Captain, right now, you're the only bird we have that can reach our team. The landing zone they're in is too small for conventional extraction aircraft, but your Hercules might just fit. It's a long shot, but it's the only shot we have." Sarah looked at the C-130 behind her. The aircraft was designed for cargo and personnel transport, not combat, search, and rescue in hostile territory. What Jackson was proposing was far beyond anything she had been trained for, even in her most advanced combat scenarios. "Major, with all due respect, a C-130 isn't a rescue helicopter. The landing requirements alone—" "I know it's impossible," Jackson interrupted. "That's why I'm asking you. Because impossible is what separates the pilots who matter from the ones who just fly in straight lines." Davis stepped forward. Captain, the weather report shows we've got maybe 45 minutes before that valley is completely socked in. If we're going to do this, we need to leave now. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, running through everything she knew about her aircraft's capabilities. The C-130 could land on rough terrain, but the kind of valley landing Jackson was describing would push both her and the aircraft far beyond their limits. One mistake would mean the deaths of not only the trapped Delta Force team but also her crew. What's the exact situation with the LZ? Sarah asked, surprising herself by considering the mission. Jackson pulled out a tactical map and spread it on the hood of a nearby vehicle. The team is here, in this valley. It's approximately 2,000 feet long and maybe 400 feet wide, mostly level ground, but surrounded by ridges that rise about 500 feet on both sides. The approach will have to be from the southwest, but it's going to be tight. Sarah studied the map, her mind automatically calculating approach angles, load factors, and the dozen other variables that could kill them all. The margins for error were practically non-existent. What about enemy positions? Davis asked. Taliban forces are positioned on the ridges, but they're focused on the team on the ground. They probably won't expect an aircraft to attempt a landing in that terrain. The element of surprise might be our only advantage. Sarah looked up at the darkening sky. Storm clouds were already building over the mountains, and she could see lightning flickering in the distance. In 30 minutes, maybe less, the valley would be invisible from the air. Major, I need to know something, Sarah said. These men we're going after, what were they doing out there? Jackson hesitated for a moment. I can't give you operational details, Captain. What I can tell you is that they gathered intelligence that could save thousands of American lives. If we lose that team, we lose information that's critical to national security. Sarah made her decision. Rodriguez, she called to her crew chief. Get this bird ready for immediate takeoff, and break out the emergency medical kit. Ma'am? Rodriguez looked confused. We're going to get some Americans out of trouble, Sarah said, climbing back toward the cockpit. Davis, I need you to plot our approach route. Lowest possible altitude to stay under radar, then a combat approach to this valley. Jackson grabbed her arm as she passed. Captain, I can't order you to do this. This is way outside your mission parameters. Sarah looked at him with the same steel in her eyes that had carried her through 8 years of combat flying. Major, you said I was just transport. Maybe it's time I proved otherwise. As they climbed into the cockpit and began their pre-flight checks, Sarah could feel the familiar mixture of fear and excitement that came with pushing the envelope. She had spent years being dismissed by her peers, told that cargo pilots were somehow less skilled than their fighter pilot counterparts. Now she had the chance to prove that flying a 70-ton aircraft into an impossible situation took just as much skill and courage as any dogfight. Tower. This is Herky 7 requesting immediate departure clearance, Sarah radioed. Herky 7, you're not scheduled for departure. What's your destination? Sarah looked at Jackson, who nodded. Tower. This is emergency extraction mission. We're going to get our boys. Herky 7. Be advised that weather in the target area is deteriorating rapidly. Recommend you delay departure. Negative, Tower. If we delay, there won't be anyone left to extract. As the C-130's engines spooled up to full power, Sarah felt the familiar vibration of her aircraft preparing to launch into danger. She had made this type of decision before, but never with stakes quite this high. 12 of America's elite soldiers were counting on a transport pilot to do the impossible. The aircraft lurched forward as Sarah released the brakes, and they accelerated down the rough runway. As they lifted off into the gathering darkness, Sarah could see the storm clouds ahead, looking like mountains themselves in the fading light. Contact the trapped team, Sarah told Jackson. Tell them their ride is coming. The flight to the valley took 23 minutes that felt like hours. Sarah kept the C-130 low, using the terrain to mask their approach from enemy radar. The storm was moving faster than predicted, and lightning was already crackling through the clouds above the target area. Team Alpha, this is Herky 7. Jackson radioed to the trapped soldiers. Be advised, We're 5 minutes out. Prepare for emergency extraction. The response crackled through static. Herky 7, this is Alpha 6. We've got enemy positions on both ridges. They've been quiet for the last 10 minutes, but they're definitely still there. LZ is marked with infrared strobes. Sarah could see the valley ahead, a dark slash between two mountain ridges. Through her night vision goggles, she could make out the faint glimmer of the infrared markers. The landing zone looked impossibly small from their approach altitude. Davis, what's our wind situation? Sarah asked her co-pilot. Crosswinds at 15 knots, gusting to 25. Not ideal, but manageable. Sarah began her descent, pushing the big aircraft down into the valley faster than any manual would recommend. The ridges on either side seemed to reach toward them like grasping fingers, and she had to constantly adjust her approach angle to avoid the rocky outcroppings. Altitude 500 feet, Davis called out. Landing gear down, Sarah commanded. The aircraft shuddered as the landing gear extended, adding drag just as they needed to maintain speed for the steep approach. Sarah could feel sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool air in the cockpit. 300 feet, speed 140 knots. The valley floor was rushing up toward them now. Sarah could see muzzle flashes on the ridges as Taliban fighters opened fire on the descending aircraft. The distinctive crack of rounds passing close to the aircraft echoed through the cargo bay. Taking fire, Rodriguez called from his position in the back. 200 feet, speed 130. Sarah could see the Delta Force team now, 12 figures in combat gear positioned around a rough circle on the valley floor. They had set up a defensive perimeter, but she could tell from their positioning that they were nearly out of ammunition. 100 feet, speed 120. This was the critical moment. Sarah had to bleed off speed fast enough to land in the short space available, but not so fast that they hit the ground too hard or stalled the aircraft. The margin for error was measured in feet and seconds. 50 feet. The ground effect from the valley floor started to cushion their descent, but Sarah could see they were coming in too fast. The end of the makeshift landing zone was rushing toward them at an alarming rate. Full reverse thrust, Sarah shouted as the main landing gear touched down. The aircraft slammed onto the rocky ground with a bone-jarring impact that threw everyone forward against their restraints. Sarah fought to keep the big plane straight as it bounced and skidded across the uneven terrain. Engines reverse. Full brakes. The C-130 shuddered and groaned as every system designed to stop it engaged simultaneously. Sarah could feel the aircraft starting to slow, but the end of the valley was still approaching too fast. Come on. Come on, she muttered, pulling back on the controls as if she could will the aircraft to stop. With less than 50 feet to spare, the C-130 finally shuddered to a halt. For a moment, the only sound was the whine of the engines winding down and the patter of small arms fire hitting the fuselage. We're down, Rodriguez called from the cargo bay. Delta team is moving to the aircraft. Sarah could see the soldiers sprinting toward the cargo ramp through her side window. Several were helping wounded teammates, and she could see that at least 2 were being carried on improvised stretchers. How long do we need? Sarah asked Jackson. 3 minutes to get everyone loaded. 3 minutes felt like an eternity under fire. Sarah could hear rounds impacting the aircraft's skin and hoped nothing critical was being hit. The enemy fire was becoming more intense as Taliban fighters realized what was happening. RPG, someone shouted from outside. Sarah watched in horror as a rocket-propelled grenade streaked past her cockpit window, missing by less than 20 feet before exploding against the valley wall. The blast illuminated the entire scene in stark orange light, revealing dozens of enemy fighters on the ridges above. 2 minutes, Rodriguez called. Sarah kept the engines running, knowing they would need every bit of power for the takeoff. Getting out of the valley would be even more challenging than getting in, especially with the additional weight of the rescue team. Last man aboard, Jackson shouted from the cargo bay. Ramp coming up, Rodriguez responded. Sarah didn't wait for confirmation. As soon as she heard the cargo ramp beginning to close, she pushed the throttles forward. The C-130 began to roll, slowly at first, then building speed as they raced toward the far end of the valley. Rotate speed in 10 seconds, Davis called out. Sarah could see the valley wall ahead of them, a dark mass rising into the storm clouds. They had to climb at the steepest possible angle to clear the ridge, but with the additional weight of the rescue team and the thin air at altitude, she wasn't sure they could make it. Rotate. Sarah pulled back on the controls, and the big aircraft reluctantly left the ground. They were climbing, but not fast enough. The ridge was still ahead of them, and they were running out of valley. Landing gear up, the aircraft climbed marginally faster with the gear retracted, but they were still below the ridgeline, with less than 500 feet of valley remaining. "We're not going to make it," Davis said quietly. Sarah pushed the throttles past their maximum rated power, forcing the engines to produce more thrust than they were designed for. The aircraft responded with a slight increase in climb rate, but it still might not be enough. "Come on, baby," Sarah whispered to her aircraft. "Just a little more." The ridge wall filled their windscreen now, a mass of rock and darkness that seemed certain to claim them. Sarah could hear shouting from the cargo bay as the soldiers realized their situation. At the last possible second, the C-130 clawed its way over the ridge, missing the rocky outcropping by less than 30 feet. Sarah felt the aircraft shake as they passed through the turbulence created by the mountain, but they were climbing into clear air. "We're clear," Davis shouted. Behind them, the valley erupted in muzzle flashes as frustrated Taliban fighters continued to fire at the escaping aircraft. But they were already out of range and climbing toward safety. "Herky 7, this is Alpha 6, came a voice from the cargo bay. "On behalf of my team, thank you for the ride." That was some pretty impressive flying for a transport pilot. Sarah smiled for the first time in hours. "Alpha 6, this is the pilot. You can tell anyone who asks that transport pilots go wherever they're needed." As they climbed toward their home base, Sarah reflected on the events of the past few hours. She had spent years hearing that she was just transport, that cargo pilots were somehow less skilled or courageous than their fighter pilot counterparts. Tonight, she had proven that flying required the same courage and skill regardless of the aircraft. Major Jackson appeared in the cockpit doorway as they leveled off for the flight home. "Captain, I owe you an apology. What you did back there, that wasn't just transport. That was warrior-level flying." Sarah looked back at the cargo bay, where medics were treating the wounded Delta Force soldiers. Some would need surgery, but they were all alive and heading home. The intelligence they had gathered would indeed save countless American lives in the months to come. "Major," Sarah said, "next time someone tells you transport pilots are just bus drivers, you might want to remind them that sometimes the bus driver has to drive through hell to get the passengers home." The flight back to base gave Sarah time to think about what had happened. She had made a split-second decision to risk everything for soldiers she had never met, in a mission that was far beyond anything she had been trained for. Yet somehow, it felt like exactly what she was supposed to be doing. When they landed at Bagram, word of the mission had already spread. Ground crews and other pilots lined the taxiway as the C-130 rolled to a stop. As Sarah shut down the engines and climbed out of the cockpit, she was surprised to see a crowd waiting for her. "Captain Chen," called out Colonel Martinez, the base commander. "I understand congratulations are in order." Sarah looked at the faces around her. Fighter pilots, helicopter crews, ground personnel, all looking at her with something she had never seen before. Respect. Not the grudging acknowledgement she had earned over the years, but genuine respect for what she had accomplished. "Sir, I was just doing my job," Sarah replied. Colonel Martinez smiled. "Captain, what you did tonight was far beyond the call of duty. The Pentagon is going to want to hear about this mission, and I suspect there are some decorations in your future." As the crowd dispersed and the rescued soldiers were taken to the medical facility, Sarah walked around her aircraft, inspecting the damage. The fuselage was peppered with bullet holes, and one engine showed signs of shrapnel damage, but the old bird had brought them all home safely. Rodriguez joined her, running his hand over one of the larger holes in the aircraft's skin. "Ma'am, this bird's going to need some serious maintenance before she flies again." "She earned it," Sarah said, patting the aircraft's nose. "She's the reason 12 of our best soldiers are going home tonight." Later, as Sarah finally made it to her quarters for a few hours of sleep before the inevitable debriefings and paperwork, She reflected on how much had changed in the space of a few hours. She was still a transport pilot, still responsible for moving cargo and personnel from point A to point B. But now everyone would know that transport pilots were capable of so much more when the situation demanded it. The next morning brought news that the intelligence gathered by Major Jackson's team had led to the disruption of a major terrorist plot against American targets. The mission Sarah had dismissed as routine had turned out to be one of the most significant operations of the entire war. 6 months later, Sarah stood on the stage at the Pentagon as she received the Distinguished Flying Cross, one of the highest decorations for aerial achievement. In the audience sat Major Jackson and the 11 other members of his team who had survived that night in the valley. During her acceptance speech, Sarah looked out at the assembled crowd of military officials and fellow pilots. For too long, we've divided military aviation into categories, as if some types of flying matter more than others. Tonight proved that, when Americans are in trouble, it doesn't matter if you fly fighters or cargo planes. What matters is that you answer the call. As she left the stage, Sarah was approached by a young female cadet from the Air Force Academy. Captain Chen. I'm planning to request transport aircraft when I graduate. My instructors say I should consider fighters instead. Sarah smiled, remembering her own doubts and the years of being dismissed by her peers. Cadet, let me give you some advice. Don't let anyone tell you that transport pilots are just drivers. Sometimes, being the driver is the most important job in the world. The story of Captain Sarah Chen's impossible rescue mission became legend in military aviation circles. It was studied in flight schools, analyzed by tactical experts, and retold in squadron-ready rooms around the world. But for Sarah, the most important recognition came from knowing that 12 American soldiers had made it home to their families because a transport pilot had refused to accept limitations. Years later, when Sarah had risen to the rank of general and commanded her own airlift wing, she would still occasionally hear the old dismissive phrase, "She's only transport." But now, those words carried a different meaning entirely. In a world where courage and skill were measured by the willingness to risk everything for others, being only transport meant being ready to fly into the impossible and bring heroes home.